Big loss for Republicans last night in the Alabama special election to fill the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. I'm going to tell you why I'm not that concerned and why I don't think it's indicative of anything going into the 2018 midterms. When I'm not here informing and entertaining you on the Rebel, I'm advising political candidates on strategic direction and communications. I do that for a good portion of my day. It's probably why Roy Moore lost, because he didn't hire me. Seriously, though, in my opinion, Roy Moore ran a terrible campaign, and that's what today's show is about. We're going to talk about why he lost in a predominantly red state, a state that Donald Trump won by nearly 30 points. I think Donald Trump won Alabama in the general election by 28 points. See, the allegations of sexual misconduct against Roy Moore hurt him. But they started to wane. They started to fizzle out as it turned out that the yearbook was tampered with. That accuser's credibility diminished. The original accuser turned out she had some personal problems in the course of her life and accused other people. Her credibility diminished. So the accusations gave Moore a ding, but they weren't the kill shot. They weren't why Democrat Doug Jones won in a heavily Republican state. It was because Roy Moore ran a terrible campaign. Roy Moore's campaign had no organization. Their grassroots get out the vote and communication strategies were abysmal. Look, here's a pro tip for any campaign people watching. It is a terrible messaging strategy to have your 70-year-old candidate respond to sexual misconduct allegations by saying, I dated teenagers and their parents were cool with it. I mean, who thought of that? Who advised him to do that? And if he did it on his own, well, that really says horrible things about his campaign team. But voter turnout was also to blame. And when voter turnout is to blame, you blame the candidate. They're uninspiring. Now, Steve Bannon's taking a lot of blame. Bannon this and Bannon that, and Bannon went against the will of the president, and Bannon destroyed the Republican Party, and Bannon handed Alabama to Democrats. But Steve Bannon wasn't the candidate. Steve Bannon wasn't the general consultant of the campaign, the person that runs it all. Steve Bannon wasn't the communications director. He wasn't the grassroots director. He wasn't the political director. He wasn't the campaign manager. All of those people fell down on the job. Doug Jones is a radical far-left Democrat, but I got to give credit where due. Doug Jones campaigned like a pro, like a madman. The guy was out there pressing the flesh, meeting voters, and convincing voters why Roy Moore is terrible. Now, look, today's voter, at this point in history, it hasn't always been this way. It's subject to change. But today's voter cares about economic and national security, populism. Roy Moore ignored that. He was completely tone deaf, as was his campaign team. When voters wanted to hear tax reform, I want more of my money back in my pocket, build a wall, deport illegals who are killing women like Kate Steinle and being acquitted. Voters wanted to hear somebody, their Senate candidate on the Republican side, say, I'm with you. I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to push through these bills. I'm going to ram them down the establishment and the Democrats' throats. Instead, Judge Roy Moore Bible thumped. He talked about the LGBT boogie lady boys under the bed. It was just too much evangelical social conservatism and not enough economic and national security populism. Combine that with a terrible messaging strategy. He faced an onslaught of unspeakable allegations, and his communications team sat idly by and did nothing. Doug Jones learned from the Virginia race, where Republican Ed Gillespie lost, the Democrat candidate there, put up an ad showing a Republican conservative in a pickup truck who supported the NRA running over little children of color while waving a Confederate flag. Doug Jones saw that worked, and he harped on it. He destroyed Moore. Doug Jones became vicious. He used opposition research and destroyed Moore's credibility. Moore did nothing. Moore's opposition research teams dug up nothing on Jones. His communications teams planted no negative stories on Jones. There was no campaign effort on the part of Moore. And in the last week of the campaign, this past week, the time when a candidate is supposed to be working around the clock, they sleep maybe 3 hours a night, while Judge Roy Moore went MIA. Jones was everywhere. He was crisscrossing the state of Alabama, shaking hands, kissing babies, and convincing people why, even if they didn't like his policies on abortion, on gay marriage, on religious liberty, that he was still better than Roy Moore. Now, did he convince anybody? Well, I don't know. He got 670,000 votes, give or take 671,000, Roy Moore 650,000. And that's really the story. Republicans simply did not turn out. The average vote tally for a Republican who prevails in Alabama is about 765,000. That's been the median for the last several elections. Roy Moore missed that mark. And that's in a midterm. That's in a mid-year election. Like this one. This was a special going into the midterms. That's not in a general election year where turnout is much higher. Roy Moore missed that mark by about 115,000, 120,000 votes. Simply put, Republican voters were not inspired. There was something off about Roy Moore. He was kind of odd. He was a hard guy to like. He wasn't lovable. He wasn't fuzzy. And not everybody can be Donald Trump. Now, that is where Steve Bannon made a serious miscalculation. Roy Moore was portrayed as the MAGA candidate, but he used a very traditional playbook. He hired a consultant out of Florida, a guy named Brett Doster, who I've crossed paths with, who was Jeb Bush's advisor. He was Roy Moore's advisor. Why in the world did the Moore campaign use a Jeb Bush advisor when promoting themselves as the MAGA campaign? It was a terrible campaign. The get out the vote efforts speak for themselves. 115,000, 120,000 less Alabama Republicans turned out for Roy Moore than they did for previous Republican candidates. That's very telling. And that goes to the grassroots strategy. No one was knocking on doors. No one was out there energizing voters, putting palm cards in their hands. It seems like Roy Moore rested on the fact that he got Steve Bannon's endorsement, and then after the primary, Donald Trump's tepid endorsement. But if you notice, the president kept him at arm's length. Donald Trump didn't travel to Alabama to campaign with Roy Moore. The GOP establishment neocons, they want to knock us down. They want to knock the MAGA movement down. They want to knock true conservatism down. They want to keep their uniparty deep state status quo in place for as long as possible. And Roy Moore enabled that. So sure, while Bannon showed up and he endorsed him and he gave a little strategic direction, Roy Moore's campaign team, that core group of managers and advisors that were with him daily, that traveled the state with him, these were Jeb people. These were milquetoast people using an establishment playbook, telling him, harp on social conservatism and evangelicalism and gay marriage and LGBT boogie lady boys under the bed. That's what people want to hear. And all voters wanted to hear was, how are you going to help me keep my own money? How are you going to protect my family? How are you going to protect me? Very simple economic and national security populism. Now, I don't think this is indicative of anything in the midterms. Like I said in my opening, I think Roy Moore was a flawed candidate from day one, even without the allegations. Roy Moore was a low-energy candidate. He was an older man. He didn't have the will to fight in him. He wasn't out there traversing the state campaigning like Doug Jones was. So even without these allegations, I think Moore would have had an uphill battle. He would have won in such a heavily plus Republican state. But I don't think it would have been the landslide that, say, a Representative Mo Brooks would have seen. I think if Mo Brooks had been the candidate, and I said that from day one, Mo Brooks would have probably won by 20 points, maybe more. He's a well-liked representative from the state of Alabama. But Mitch McConnell and the Democrats didn't want Mo Brooks. They fought against him. And Steve Bannon miscalculated. So he went against Mo Brooks because in the general election, Mo Brooks backed Ted Cruz, not Donald Trump. But Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, politically anyway, have made amends. They support each other's policies. Ted Cruz has been a good defender of the president. And Steve Bannon probably should have given this one a little more thought. I always thought Roy Moore was a weird guy. I always thought he was a flawed candidate. I didn't like the allegations against him. I didn't like that the Washington Post came in and tried to swing and rig Alabama's special election. I never was a rah-rah-rah Moore guy like I was for Donald Trump, like I will be for our great governor here in Florida, Rick Scott, when he runs for the U.S. Senate. And like I am for many other candidates, Scott Eulinger, a candidate, full disclosure, that I represent up in Pennsylvania 15, a great candidate in Missouri for Senate, Tony Minetti, a former B-2 stealth bomber pilot. Really, really interesting, great candidates. Those candidates energize me, but a guy like Roy Moore never did. But again, in the final analysis, Cardillo's final analysis, it wasn't so much the allegations that hurt Roy Moore as it was a terrible communications messaging strategy that thought it was a good idea for their 70-year-old, already kind of creepy candidate to say, yep, I dated teenagers if their mom and dad thought it was cool. That was just bizarre. And when I felt it was the beginning of the end, zero grassroots effort in a state like Alabama, in the South, where people love their neighbors, they care very much about trust, people they know, you need to earn their trust. He needed to be out there shaking hands, kissing babies, and re-earning their trust after the allegations. Didn't do that. There was no get out the vote effort, and Republicans are terrible at get out the vote efforts. Here in Florida, the most important swing state, I see Democrat GOTV get out the vote efforts night and day at supermarkets, at campuses, at arenas, outside sporting events, outside concerts, in parks, at street fairs. I never see a table for the Republicans. Republicans are abysmal at getting people out to vote, and it showed last night. It showed last night. And there was no political direction for Roy Moore last night. He was picking issues that nobody cared about. And when your political, communications, grassroots, and get out the vote teams aren't working with your campaign manager and your general campaign consultant, your campaign is doomed. So at the end of the day, it wasn't the allegations that brought Roy Moore down. It was Roy Moore's presence and an abysmal campaign team and campaign strategy. I want to keep bringing you these analyses, so please subscribe to our premium service at www.therebel.media/shows. If you're already a subscriber, thanks very, very much. I will be back with you tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching.